country.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So, a few announcements. Let me get these going out. We've got a short paper that will be due, but I will talk about that momentarily while those sheets are going out. So remember, as always, we've got, or not always, but we do have a reading quiz that will open today. So keep that in mind if you want to go ahead and take that. We also have a review quiz, but of course that won't open till Friday. The short paper 1 is due by 11:59 p.m. Monday, but it is a very short paper. It's actually 2 paragraphs long, so it's not terribly difficult. But basically, you're going to write a paper in 2 paragraphs. The paper should be 400, 700 words in length. In the first paper, you will summarize how either the pictures to draw tears from iron or the Bianchi Zai pictorial utilize images to persuade Chinese people to think or act in a particular way. Be sure to use concrete examples. I need you to actually refer to specific images, right? So you don't want to say, well, they showed sad pictures to make people sad, so they would give money, right? Something like that. You want to give me an example. In the second paragraph, then you would describe how you think Wang Lung or Olan from the Good Earth, or Magistrate Huang Lu Heng from the Few chapter of the Death of Woman Wrong would have reacted to this message. And again, you have to argue that, right? You have to use particular statements, particular actions from those respective readings to explain why they would have reacted that way. So I think that Magistrate Huang would have done this because in the story, he did this. Right? So that's what I'm looking for. Failure to follow the 2-paragraph format result in penalty or grade. This paper is worth 25 points. It should be submitted on Blackboard before class is noted on the schedule. If you upload it late, there's a penalty. It should be in a doc or docx file. It's not in readable format. It will result in a penalty or grade, and I can't grade it until it's in a readable format. You should, when you upload it, it should show you, right? Blackboard will show you whether it's readable or not. If you can read it after you upload it, I can read it. If you cannot read it after you upload it, I cannot read it. So any questions about that? Yes, Madison.
In terms of like citing the pictures, do you just want us to
If you just describe the picture, just tell me what the picture is. Okay. It's a short enough read, but thank you. Good question. Yeah, I'm not looking for any particular citation for. Basically, your description should be sufficient enough that I understand what you're referring to. Gemma, was that your question?
Yes.
Great minds think alike. Okay. So now we're moving to something else, right? We're moving to this fourth section, external and internal pressures. And this is when, I've been trying to build up for you an idea of China as a dynamic place, a place that could be extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, right? That's what we've tried to see so far. It was not this poor, corrupt place that was unmoving or unchanging. Now, we can look at it and say, well, there are certain things that they didn't develop. They're not going to go through a scientific revolution yet. The government is not developing in a way that would encourage business in the way that we would expect a European country to be doing so during this time period. But it's hard to criticize someone for something that they're not doing, in a sense, when they have no reason to do those things. In the 18th century, it was not yet made clear how what Europe was doing was going to be make Europe so powerful. It will be made very clear in the 19th century. And that's where we're going now. Right? Moving into the 19th century, we're going to understand how now China, which has been doing really, really well, is going to have a really, really hard time. And I have to stress, we'll talk more about this later, if you want to understand why the Chinese, particularly the People's Republic of China, how it sees the world, you have to understand that it sees the world through this history, right? Through this decline we're going to talk about. So we have to keep that in mind. This may be new material to you. Tian Yu is going to know all this stuff already, forwards and backwards, right? He's going to know all this stuff because it was drummed into him all throughout school in China. Yeah. The century of humiliation. Never forget national humiliation, I think is the slogan. So we're going to understand the external and internal pressures placed on China during the 18th century, understand why the Chinese government reacted as it did to these issues and what shaped those reactions, and understand how Chinese people reacted to these changes. Notice, I'm making a stronger difference between government and people. It's during this time period where we start talking more about how Chinese people, as people outside the government, are having influence. Right? So far, mostly everyone I talk about is a government official. We've been talking about emperors. Now we're going to talk about people who aren't. Yes, Max?
Are you recording?
Yes, I believe I am, Max. Thank you for the reminder. It is recording. And we're going to understand the complex relationship with Western countries. It was very complex, right? Chinese people in Western countries could work together for mutual benefit. They could also really bug each other and kill each other. Right? So we'll talk about that. So here's the thing, remember Qianlong? Everything was great under Qianlong. Remember, that's the guy that canceled taxes 4 times, said no one's got to pay taxes? That's pretty awesome, right? But there's going to be problems. During his reign, and the problem is people don't really see it, it's very slow, but there's going to be declining per capita wealth. So there's going to be less stuff for more people. Between 1685 and 1780, the population will triple. Right? And this is a nice population chart. I want to point out, this is the Ming Qing transition. They didn't lose 50 million people, but the government lost the ability to count people. Right? So the government was able to count people because it was so weak. But they did lose millions of people in that transition. But look at how the population is going to go up. Right? It gets huge. Right? 100 million people by 1850, 430 million people. That is a lot of people. That's a lot of people.
Than we have right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's more than the United States has right now. But during that same time period, the cultivated land only doubles. So at a certain point, remember I said this is, when your population goes up in a pre-modern society, a lot of times that means things are going well. It means that people are having enough food to eat, and so they're able to develop, they're able to grow up and have their own children. But you eventually reach a point where more laborers does not equal more food. You've got all the people you can have working efficiently on this piece of land. You can't add more people to that piece of land. You can't add more land. So that means less stuff, more people. Right? So people get bored. The other problem is there's no increase in the number of officials. Right? The government tries to stay the same. They're not going to have more people governing. So you can kind of think about this. You know, I'm teaching a super section, what we call this semester. I've got one class, 100 level class with 38 people, another one with 66. It's interesting how that changes everything, because you still have one teacher but twice as many students. Right? And it causes a lot of issues. One thing I think is interesting is a lot more people skip class, even though I call roll. And I email them when they skip class. I'm like, why are you skipping class? It doesn't matter, there's more people. So you can imagine that, right? Imagine this class had twice as many people, and then 3 times as many people. Completely change things. So that's a problem. And the issue is the Chinese government doesn't really realize this till it's too late, because this problem is so slow developing, right? Remember, Yongzheng's tax reforms will not continue. Why bother? We have so much money, people don't even have to pay taxes, right? We can just cancel taxes. So why would we push the gentry to pay taxes? We need them to help us rule when we don't need the money. So in a sense, the Qing are a victim of their own success. They did so well for so long that they don't make the systematic reforms that they needed to make. They're not going to be successful at seeking new forms of revenue during this time period. They will later. But during this time period, no, they don't. And the problem is, by the time they realize it's a problem, they don't have enough money or other resources to fix the system. So if they have too much, when they have enough, they don't realize it's a problem. By the time they realize the problem, they don't have the ability to fix it. So they're just in a really difficult situation. A lot of this section is talking about how that happens. So we're first going to talk about internal pressures. So similar to the Ming, the Qing are going to face economic difficulties and corruption that made it difficult to deal with crises. We saw the exact same thing with the Ming. Now, I have some more quotes I want to go through from this textbook. I don't make you buy the whole textbook or read it, but it does have some really good things that I want to highlight. So over the 19th century, imperial institutions were profoundly rattled by internal decline and external pressure. So when you think about what's going on in China right now, they're facing 2 big problems. They're facing internal problems and foreign problems. Think about it this way. Imagine if the United States had to fight the American Civil War and World War II at the same time. That's essentially what China has to do. China's going to face serious internal and external problems at the same time. The growing antagonism between local governments and grassroots communities was aggravated by rapidly worsening economic and environmental conditions such as flooding and droughts. So there's already problems developing between the people and the government. Remember, the Chinese government is supposed to take care of the people. It's supposed to keep people safe, make sure they have enough food to eat, make sure they have clothes to wear. But it's failing to do that. The Chinese government is not able, because it lacks the resources, to deal with flooding. People lose their houses, the government's supposed to help them. But instead of helping them, it's going to tax them and give them nothing. The ensuing crisis hastened the erosion of government control in China along the borders. In the hinterlands, so disaster-stricken and land-hungry peasants joined rebels and openly challenged Qing authorities. People don't get enough food to eat. The government's job is to make sure we have enough food to eat. People start saying, maybe they've lost the mandate of heaven. Maybe we need to overthrow them and get a new government. Along the borders, the government had to relax its grip and witness the rise of secessionist movements. Right, so the government's becoming weaker, and it makes it difficult for it to help people. Difficult to do its job, which means it loses more resources, which means it becomes even weaker. So it's in a bad situation. As the tax burden grew heavier, right, rich people could avoid, now the government wants taxes, and it's going to pressure people to get more taxes. Rich people aren't paying taxes. The poor are paying taxes, right? The rich are too powerful. As the tax burden grew heavier, many small landholders, so small farmers, operating on small margins, people who don't make enough food, don't grow much food, don't make much money, became insolvent and had to give up their farms, usually selling them to larger landlords. Great, the poor get poorer, the rich get richer. Not a good situation. Meanwhile, the value of land and other property, usually also measured in silver, plummeted. The Depression also resulted in a credit crunch that caused the collapse of many native banks. Right? These weren't public, large-scale institutions, but there were some banks in China, and those things are going to start collapsing. And if you study American history, you know the bank collapsing is what led to the Great Depression. You need to borrow money, and what you can borrow money from. There's problems. Capital markets, places where you get money, dried up as increased transaction costs and falling prices put stress on manufacturers, and they had difficulty paying back their loans. To lower their costs, businesses cut their workforces, leading to higher unemployment. Remember, who was the guy that led the rebels against the Ming? Why did he take up arms against the Ming? Does anyone recall?
Dang, I can't think of it right now.
You remember?
They didn't want to give him a job.
He had a job. He was a post office worker, and they fired him to save money, and then he led a rebellion. The problem is people that are unemployed are angry and they have nothing to lose. And there's a bunch of unemployed people who have nothing to lose. That's not good for the government. The income gap between rich and poor widened, giving rise to a wave of tax and rent resistance movement and other forms of civil unrest. So in the 19th century, the economic situation is changing. Like I said, the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. And people who have nothing to lose can be very dangerous, right, to this social order. Okay, almost done. But I think this helps us to really set the stage. With the tax quota still frozen at its 1713 level, so even though the number of people had gone way up, from here all the way up to here, right? The number of people went way up. The tax quota was still the same. This government surplus income steadily deteriorated, right? The Qing had promised not to raise taxes because they were doing so well. Now the problem is they're having trouble collecting taxes, and they really need to raise them, but they can't because of this promise. As government spending on payroll and public projects shrank in real terms, corruption and embezzlement spread, and the Qing government became increasingly hamstrung as inept. Remember how we talked about earlier how officials had to be at least a little bit corrupt to do their job? Now they have to be a lot corrupt, and a lot of times even then they can't do their job because there's just not enough money. Right? You can only tax people without money so much. So that the government does not have enough money. However, the government, even though it doesn't have resources, it is still expected to regulate the grain market by the granary system. Basically, they had a system where if the price of grain went too high, the government would buy grain and then sell it at a reduced cost, which would drive down the cost of grain. They can't do that anymore. They don't have the money. Maintain waterworks and flood control and deliver famine relief. But its capacity to fulfill these responsibilities fell precipitously. Officials neglected infrastructure as the cost of maintaining dams and irrigation systems increased in real terms. You know, we've got this declining infrastructure, but we don't have any money, so we can't fix it. One of these days, that dam is going to break and flood fields and kill people. But we can't do anything about it because we don't have the money. And when that happens, when we lose taxpayers and we lose their farms, we'll have even less money. There's no way they can break out of this. They allow the emergency stores of grain held in granaries to decline, making it less likely that hard-hit communities would see adequate relief efforts. Such actions and inactions resulted in more frequent disasters and exacerbated the suffering when they happened. The state was no longer capable of alleviating people's hardships. Victims of subsistence crises could no longer count on help from local governments. So remember, the government exists in Chinese political theory to take care of the people. And the people have the right to rebel when heaven's mandate changes because the government has become immoral and can no longer take care of the people. The government, because of these economic problems, cannot take care of the people. They want to, but they can't. And as funding for defense evaporated, military efficacy plummeted just at the moment when new domestic and foreign threats had to be countered. So here's two big things we have to get out of this. First of all, the people are really angry, because the government's not taking care of them, and because the government isn't taking care of them because they don't have enough money, the government also doesn't have money for military defense. So when the people are angriest and most willing and able to rebel, the government doesn't have a military to deal with those rebellions. Right? So the economic problem causes people to be angry and upset and want to rebel, and the economic problem also means the military is very weak. And also, just when the West is becoming strong and powerful in the 19th century, that's when China is becoming weaker. If the Europeans would have hit China in the 18th century more, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. But the Europeans come, and later the Americans, when China is weak and doesn't have enough money to deal with these problems. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, I want to give you some examples of some peasant rebellions. Right? This is one example of the internal pressures. Right? Peasant rebellions. So just as a reminder, government revenue peaked in 1770. That's when the government had its most money. It was 15% lower in 1800 when they have another generation of people to deal with. So remember, the government's becoming poorer. People are becoming poorer, the government's becoming poorer. People remember that, right? Think about this. You know how like old people talk about like the good old days? And sometimes it's overrated. This time it's real. You know, your grandfather's like, you know what, we used to actually eat meat sometimes, but now we can't afford to eat meat. I remember when we used to eat 3 meals a day, now we're only eating 2. And so people are like, there's something wrong. Things used to be better. Like something's wrong, you know, things are declining. Why are they declining? Something's wrong. Well, and here was one thing we also have to emphasize about how things worked in China. This is why I said what's difficult about history, but remember how I showed you those images about female infanticide, where people were drowning girls? Now that's a problem, I mean, morally, but it's also a problem socially. Because what happens is you get a skewed male to female gender ratio. Basically, you have guys who won't be able to find wives. They won't be able to form families. Remember, the good life for peasants, you get married, you have kids. Right? Kids are very important because kids work for free. Right? They help you to develop your household economically. Right? My dad's from a farming family. He had 8 brothers and sisters. Right? That's kind of how it works, free labor. By the way, child labor laws don't apply to farms in the United States, which I think is interesting. So here's the problem. You have not enough women. You have all these guys who are not married and who will never marry. I can tell you, I'm a lot more careful now that I'm married and have 2 kids than I was when I was 18 and I didn't. I drive more carefully, because if something happens to me, what's going to happen to my family, right? That makes us more conservative and more careful, less likely to rebel. But you got a lot of guys now who are poor and are so poor they know they're never going to get married, and they're particularly angry. In addition, what makes them really upset, remember how I said the rich get richer? Remember in China, it's perfectly okay if you're rich to have lots of wives or concubines. So that further makes a problem. You know, you have a guy that has a dozen concubines, and you've got all these poor men who can't marry anyone. Right? That's why Wang Lung was very poor. He had to marry a slave, but at least he got married. And we call these men we call bare branches. They're like branches of a tree that will never have fruit. Right? They will never have kids. Remember, in Chinese society, it's very important to have kids. Who's going to take care of you when you're old? And also remember, when you die, you need descendants to feed you in death. If not, you're not going to have anyone to take care of you. One of the most insulting things you could say to someone in China during this time period was, may you never have may you never have children. Because it was so important. So think about it. You've got all these angry guys who have terrible standards of living, but they see the rich getting richer, they can't even marry. They've got nothing to lose. And then you have these ideas. You have religious ideas. For example, in Buddhism, I always talk about how people would just say the Buddha, and I'm like, which one? There's lots of Buddhas. Right? Siddhartha Gautama is the historic Buddha. That's the Buddha of the past. But Buddhism is cyclical. Buddhists believe that Buddhism will do well for a while, and then will do badly, and then you'll have to have a new Buddha to refound the religion. Right? So things will go well for a while, then decline, then they will have a new founder, and then do well, decline, do well, decline. Well, people looked around and said, you know what? I think we're living in a declining period. Things are getting worse. Remember when things were good? Now they're getting much worse. And they said, maybe the future Buddha is coming. Right? The future Buddha is coming. Maitreya is the future Buddha. So if you were to go to a Chinese restaurant, you may see a statue like this. That's not the historic Buddha. That's the future Buddha. I think Miruk in Korean, Miruk. But I don't know the Chinese, actually. Maitreya is the Sanskrit, I think. But this is the Buddha of the future. And like I said, he's chubby, smiling Buddha. That indicates when he comes, we'll enter a time of prosperity. Things will get better. Right? Things are going to get better. So we have a memory of things that are worse. Or I'm sorry, we have a memory of things used to be better. We have all these guys who are angry, who don't have families, who will never have families. But then you have this idea that things will get better, that Maitreya is coming. And Maitreya, it turns out, wants us to rebel against the government. Right? There will arise sectarian teachers, religious leaders, who will say, we're entering a time when Maitreya is coming. We need to prepare the way by overthrowing this wicked government, this evil government. And this will lead to multiple rebellions in China. Right? This will lead to multiple rebellions. The Buddha is higher than the emperor. It's okay for us to attack the government. Government's doing a bad job. And this is the Buddha. Buddha is higher than the emperor. So it's okay for us to rebel. And you're a poor guy. You're never going to have kids. There's all these rich people around who've got more than enough. This message sounds pretty attractive. So eventually you're going to have the growth of this sectarian religion. They will often join with bandits, and then later will become rebels, who will rebel against the government in hopes that after a violent apocalypse in which they overthrow the government, they will establish a utopia. So I gave you that background just to show you how economic issues were becoming a serious issue in the late 18th, early 19th century. It leads people to start believing in this kind of religious system and wanting to bring change. So I'm going to give you an example of one of many rebellions, right? One of many rebellions. This is the one that occurred in 1813 called the 8 Trigrams Rebellion. This is a minor rebellion. This is a small rebellion. Small things in China are quite big in other places. But this small rebellion covered 3 provinces and took place in 12 cities. It involved an army of 100,000 people rebelling against the Qing. That's small for China, but you may keep in mind during the American Civil War, that was like the size of Grant's army, which is a big army for the Americans. In this rebellion, 80,000 people died. What's really striking about this, and this is why, if you want to understand why China takes the religious policy it does today, religion could be very dangerous from the Chinese perspective. Why? If you look at the membership, it encouraged peasants and wealthy people. It could get people from all strata of society, kind of like a government. Right? It's not just rich people, it's wide-ranging, like a government. So it could replace the current government. And also, there were people, yamen runners are people who work for the government. They're like messengers who work for the magistrate. The people, remember the magistrate from the Feud chapter, how he had all those officials, all those people working for him? These were the kinds of people who worked for him. And some of them rebelled. So government functionaries take part in the rebellion. Right? Eunuchs, including those who were part of the imperial household. So this took place in the palace. The palace was actually briefly under siege. So even a small rebellion could be quite dangerous. Actually, a couple of Manchu princes in the palace actually got guns and started shooting at the rebels. Right? That's how serious this was. Actually, the rebels got into the palace. Manchu princes had a blast, by the way, that did that. They were so happy to finally get, everyone was always trying to take care of them and keep them away from any danger. And like, woohoo! They were like in their late teens, early 20s, so it was fun for them. So this is serious stuff, and this is just one rebellion. And that's what we're starting to see now. Right? Things are bad. Remember how in section 3 we ended with the dreams of the red chamber? And I tried to say how, no one could think of anything better? They just said, yeah, we just got to deal with it. Things have gotten so bad now people are thinking, how can we fix this? How can we change this? So how do you deal with this? Well, Qinlong, as great as he was in many ways, here, if I can give you one piece of, I'm not a good leader, but if I can give you one piece of good advice about being a leader, know when to stop leading, know when to retire. Kangxi should have retired when he got too old, frankly speaking. Right? Remember, he didn't do a good job late in life. Qinlong did the same thing. Qinlong got old and was just not able to be a good emperor anymore, but he didn't abdicate when he should have. He should have said, okay, now it's time for my kid to take charge. If you took my Japanese history class, Tokugawa Ieyasu did it right. He retired early and then helped his son. But these guys don't want it. So Qinlong created a lot of problems. There were a lot of issues, so that when he finally retired, and his successors had a lot of problems to deal with. And unfortunately, because they didn't have the ability to raise more revenue, they cut expenses. Right? right? They cut expenses. But I just tried to highlight, how can you cut expenses when there's more people to govern? You can't do that. How can you buy less grain to give poor people when there's more poor people? You can't do that. So these poor guys, I feel bad for them because I don't know what they could have done. Right? And you know you're in trouble. This emperor, I won't make you memorize his name, he started wearing robes with patches to try and get shame his bureaucrats into being more careful with money. But that's not a good sign for your dynasty when the emperor's wearing patched robes. Right? It's not a good situation. So this works within a certain limit, but how can you maintain good government without money? They're going to emphasize return to Confucian values. That's kind of their solution. We need to serve the people. We need to be less corrupt. We need to work hard. We need to be thrifty. We need to consume less. But the problem is, how do you do that and be powerful? Right? You need money. You need resources, the government, in order to bring power. And here's the problem. So in a sense, to deal with these economic problems, the Qing Empire is becoming more conservative just when the modern world is coming. Right? They're becoming less open just when the Europeans are coming and saying, you guys got to open up. Okay. So I apologize, there's a bit more lecturing in a row, but we'll get to a clip shortly. Some sections I just have to talk about to get the material down. So now we talk about the West coming. So we talked about the internal pressure. Now we're talking a little bit more external pressure, like China's interactions with the West. So when Western traders first come to China, they're going to focus on the city of Guangzhou, but what they call Canton. Right? It's called Guangzhou today in China. I'm going to refer to as Canton because that's what the videos and readings refer to it as. But this is where they're at. Notice it's really far from Beijing. It's really far from Beijing. Part of that is just practical because when Europeans come to China, they come from this direction, and that's like the closest port, so it kind of makes sense. But also, keep them away from politics. Right? We don't want those foreign barbarians messing up our political system. Keep them away from power. Yes, Dylan?
Also, if they're running out of money and they have to cut corners on the palace, it
Right.
might make them seem more weak in their national capital.
Excellent. Very good point, yeah, especially when that happens. It's not yet during this time period, but yeah, when it does happen later. Now to give you a highlight so you can see it, that's Guangzhou, that's Canton. Remember Macau, where the Western missionaries went? It's right there. It's really close. And of course, here's Hong Kong.
Wow.
Which is, all this stuff's very close together. So what's interesting was that there was actually a trade monopoly held by Canton Guangdong for Western trade, right? Trade with Western European countries. And it's kind of interesting because at one point the Qing government actually wanted to break the monopoly, but the people in Canton protested and the government had to back down. Which I think is interesting, right? Don't think the emperor can do whatever he wants. The emperor cannot do whatever he wants. He has to think about the people he governs. So there was an attempt to say that other cities could trade with the West, but the people in Guangzhou hated that. They wanted to keep making money. So they didn't want that to change. Now, people sometimes misunderstand this. China was not anti-trade, but they did want limited trade. There's a difference, right? China wasn't like, we don't want any trade at all. They did want limited trade. Why? Well, remember, it helps prevent piracy. Right? That's why they let the Portuguese into Macau. And the Chinese were correct about this, by the way. China, whenever they had problems with pirates, they would allow increased trade. A lot of times the pirates would just become merchants. But also, remember, especially in the late 18th and 19th century, this made them more money. Right? They taxed the trade. This helped them deal with their growing budget deficit. They maybe should have allowed more trade so they could tax more, but this helped some. And one reason the government did accept a monopoly was it limited smuggling. You can't collect, the reason people smuggle legal goods is to avoid paying taxes. Right? So they want to make sure that people pay their taxes. And if you just have one port that you have to watch, it's easier to prevent smuggling. This also, of course, limits foreign influence. We can just keep the foreigners isolated in this one city. They won't go around messing up stuff. But also, in fairness to the Qing, not many ports had the capacity to deal with Western traders. You can kind of think about this. During this time period, it took like a year to make the voyage to and from China. So if I'm going from Britain, and I go all the way to China, practically speaking, it takes about a year. I don't mean just the voyage, I mean including all the buying and selling. So the problem is, I have to go to a big port that can hold a big Western ship, and it has enough stuff for me to buy, because I got to fill up my ship to make money, because I can only come back and forth once a year. Not many Chinese ports could do that. So for these reasons, right, this monopoly is going to hold in this little city of Guangzhou Canton, far from the political center. So many Westerners, and an increasing number of Western people, are going to come trade in China. This is one thing I like to tell my, for my business majors. I mentioned this in World Civilization. Trade is something that brings people together, right? And we will figure out language barriers and cultural barriers if we can trade with each other. So there's lots of Westerners coming to trade in China, but they find that they're isolated. They don't like that. You know, if you're think about this, if you're a British person during this time period and you go to Europe, you can go where you want and trade. No one tells you what to do. But in China, you're only allowed to trade in this one place, right? You're only allowed to trade in this one place. Not only that, you can't even leave your special district. It's not like Europeans can go wherever they want in Guangzhou. They can't even do that. There's one little district inside that gigantic city, and they have to stay there. So they're not happy about that. And also, they're kept isolated from the Chinese government. Right? The Chinese government sees these Western people as barbarians. They're certainly not equal. And if you're European, where trade is really encouraged, you're used to being able to travel freely, and you're used to being able to talk to government officials. Again, if I'm a British person in, like a Hanover, a German principality, I can complain to the Hanover government or complain to my own government to help me out. But in China, you're not allowed to do that. So there's a cultural clash here. Now, the way that the Chinese government did this, they actually had what was called the Kohong system. Right? They had this thing called the Kohong system, which was a monopoly. They had what they called monopoly merchants. There were only certain merchants who could trade with Western people. So if I'm a British person, it's not like I can just walk into any store and buy stuff. I can only buy stuff from these Kohong guys. Someone like this, this is a Chinese person, merchant, painted by a Western artist. And for this privilege, they were taxed. Right, so I'm a Chinese merchant. I'm allowed to trade with the merchants, Western merchants, but I had to pay for the privilege. Right, so this is a monopoly system, very different from Western style of government. Also, these people were responsible for the behavior of foreigners. So if I'm like a British person and I come to here and I misbehave, one of these merchants will get in trouble. Right, so very different ideas of justice. Right, Europeans tend to focus on individual punishment. Chinese tend to think in a more group-oriented way. Now, there's also, I want to stress, these people have profitable working relationships, right? Because of this monopoly system, you tend to build up a relationship between Chinese and Western merchants, right? They become friends. They become business partners, and it's mutually profitable. And just to give you one example, you could lose, if you were a merchant, it was very dangerous. If you lost your ship, you could lose everything. You could be ruined. And this actually happened to, I believe it was actually a British merchant. His ship sank, and he lost everything. He survived, but he lost all his money. He was going to go bankrupt. And his Chinese business partner said, "Don't worry, we're going to ignore all your debts. Your debt's gone. And in fact, we're going to loan you some more money so you can restart your business." Right? So the Chinese had this kind of business practice where they were willing to build long relationships and encourage each other in this way. And they even did this they did this with foreign merchants too. So it's a complex relationship, right? There's things that they don't like about each other, but also you have British or European people and Chinese people forming good relationships. But it was also frustrating. There was a British man named Charles Elliot who was a government representative from Britain, and he wanted to talk to a Chinese government official, and he was beaten for it. Right? The Chinese guards just slapped him around because he dared to try and talk to a Chinese official. Now, if you're British, this is really bad. This doesn't make any sense. If you're European at all, or American, we just want to talk to the government. We have issues that we want to talk to the government about. You won't even let us talk to the government. But the Chinese perspective is you guys are barbarians. You don't need to take barbarians seriously. You don't have the right. Who are you to think you can talk to the government? But I talk about trade. I need to show you these are the kinds of things being traded. This is a sewing table. Right? This is what a European woman or American woman later would have wanted from China. It's kind of sewing table. Lights. This is a bowl, porcelain bowl. So we call porcelain China. It comes from China originally. But this is interesting because this is the foreign quarters. Right, so the Chinese made a bowl depicting the foreign quarters. And this is a fan celebrating the U.S. Ship, the Empress of China, coming into the China trade. Right, and the Chinese made pictures of the ships. Now, what is going to happen during this time period is there's going to be advances in shipbuilding. We're going to go from what are called like East Indiamen, which took months to cross the ocean to get to China. It's going to shift to what are called clipper ships. Clipper ships are very hard to sail, but they can take a voyage of months and reduce it down to weeks. So these are very fast ships. And in particular, T-clippers are going to be developed. Right? So these ships are going to be able to travel very quickly from Britain and the rest of Europe. I focus a lot on Britain, you'll see why later. They're going to go quickly from Europe to China, and they can make many trips. So what this means is more and more Europeans, and like I said, Americans, are going to want to trade with China. So you can see where there's a collision course. Qing wants limited trade. Western people want more trade. Right? And they have very different ideas about how this all should be undertaken. And like I said, I wanted to focus especially on Britain. Great Britain, we have to remember in this time period, is a trading empire. Right? British wealth is based on trade. I think by this time the British could not even grow enough food to feed themselves. Right? So they were dependent on trade to survive. Their wealth, their power was all based on, fundamentally on trade. The Industrial Revolution is just starting, so Britain hasn't become like a huge industrial center yet. It's focused on trade. And just to give you a concrete example, 10% of Britain's government income came from the tax on tea. Think about how much tea the British are drinking. And of course, most of that tea comes from China. So it's very important to the British government. Think about it, 10%. If that trade were to go away, the government becomes a lot poorer. If that trade increases, the government becomes richer. So not only do European people want to trade more, European governments also want to trade more, because more trade means more money. So they want to expand the trade. So now I have a clip I want to play for you. This is from an older documentary, so the production values aren't as good, but I like how it's set up. So as you watch this, I want you to catch, what do the British want in this clip? How did the Chinese see them? Why did the emperor give it to them? And what were these strange objects? Right? What were these strange objects?
For centuries, China had allowed foreign traders access to these goods as a matter of noblesse oblige. To its rulers, China was the master civilization, and all other nations tributary states. This was not the relationship Great Britain had in mind. In 1793, a British emissary named Lord Macartney was sent to Peking to ask the Emperor Qianlong to treat Great Britain as an equal trading partner.
McCartney said he was representing King George, and King George wanted to say hello and pay his respects and start trade. Well, said the Qianlong Emperor, if this George fellow wants to kowtow, that's all right. Go ahead. But, we don't really need you. You're rather quaint. You wear some funny, rather stuffy clothes. These presents you brought us are not very much, considering what we're used to. But it's perfectly all right. If you want to be vassals of China, good, go ahead. But don't ask for any favors.
Our ways have no resemblance to your barbarous land. As your ambassador can see for himself, our celestial kingdom possesses all things in prolific abundance. We have never valued strange objects, nor do we have the slightest need for your country's manufacturers.
Okay. So, in a word, that word I think begins with an E. What do the British want? Single word begins with an E. Equality. Right? They want to deal with China as equals. This is, in a sense, we have kind of think about, continues to this day, we have kind of a contest of egos. Right? Just like the United States and China today, both of us think of ourselves as superpowers, we're going to have conflict. Well, this time period is more Great Britain and China are going to have this kind of conflict. Right? China sees itself as the center of civilization. Great Britain also sees itself that way, for different reasons, but they see themselves that way. So the British want more political equality with China. They want to actually have an ambassador in Beijing. And there's a huge thing the clip didn't go into. There's this big argument about about how the British ambassador, Lord Macartney, how he should greet the emperor, because they thought he should kowtow, right? The Chinese wanted him to get down on his hands and knees and hit his head 3 times on the ground. And he said, no, I won't do that. I don't do that to my own king. Why would I do it to you? And they went back and forth. And McCartney said, well, you know what? I will do that, but you have to have a Chinese official of equal rank do it to a picture of King George III. And the Chinese just thought this was ludicrous, right? They're just like, who are you people to think that you're somehow equal to us, right? But this was just how the system worked in Europe. In Europe, there was a European nation-state system. Well, all governments are legally equal. In international law, powerful countries are equal to weak countries. Right? You know, Belgium has just as much power as Germany in international law, for example. But that's not how the Chinese saw things. They said, we're the best, we're the center, you guys need to do what we say. You need to accept an inferior position. And of course, the other thing they wanted was greater economic opportunities. They wanted to do more trade, right? They wanted to do more trade. The Chinese, of course, saw them as barbarians, right? Why do you think the emperor gave in? What did he say about China? Yeah, we have everything we need. We have everything we need. So even though he brings scientific instruments, right, Lord Macartney, the strange objects will include the best that 18th century Britain has to offer. They have like a little miniature train. They have like astronomical devices. Tianlong Emperor doesn't care. He's like, we've got, we're doing fine. I canceled taxes 4 years. We're doing fine. We don't need you guys. And again, you can't blame him too much because the British don't seem that powerful. They do seem strange. He said, we're doing just fine. Later, though, as Britain industrializes, it's going to get really bad for China.
Do you think they got to a point where they were like, oh, we should have took them up on it?
I don't know if anyone would go that far, but there is this growing idea, especially in the 1860s and 70s, we need to open up more.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is really interesting what Lord Macartney wrote about China. Right? He says, this is the guy that they mentioned there, that's him. The Empire of China is an old, crazy, first-rate man of war. If you're not familiar, man of war is like a battleship. It's a very powerful ship. Which a fortunate succession of able and vigilant officers have contrived to keep afloat for these 150 years past. So the Emperor, basically China is just ready to fall apart. But you've got some good officials, you've got some good emperors who've kept it going. And to overawe their neighbors merely by her bulk and appearance. But whatever an insufficient man happens to have the command on deck, adieu to the discipline and safety of the ship. She may perhaps not sink outright, she may drift sometime as a wreck, and will then be dashed to pieces on the shore, but she can never be rebuilt on the old bottom. Meaning, you can't rebuild this ship in the same way. It's amazing how right he is, right? How prescient he was. I think he's wrong. I think in the sense that he gives so much attention to the emperors and officials. But he is correct that this thing is going to fall apart. And you can't rebuild it the same way. China is going to have to undergo a revolution. Right? The dynastic system that had worked so well for thousands of years can't work anymore. It's going to take about a century to fix that. This is what a historian is going to write, which I think is very similar. While the growing European presence was increasingly felt along the China coast, before 1800 its effects were limited, and the empire seemed to have little to be concerned about. Notice, 1793 is when this exchange happened. But after 1800, growing global trade and political expansion produced disruptions that could not easily be contained, and it resulted in a fundamental reordering of the balance of power in China. An economic downturn hit the Chinese empire, which was related to changes in global markets, and in consequence led to rural impoverishment. So China's become increasingly integrated, and unfortunately that can be bad. Right? Global economic problems are going to impact China more, lead to more poor people in the countryside, the people who will bring the communists to power. The situation of rural population was worsened by environmental problems and the inability of Chinese government institutions to provide efficient relief. We already talked about that. The changes of terms of trade, the influx of opium and the spread of new ideas posed stiff new challenges that the empire's institutions found difficult to adapt to and to manage. At the same time, Europe pursued vigorous, strong-arm policies aimed at expanding its political and economic reach into China at a time when the West was entering a period of rapid scientific and technological development. China's weak and becoming weaker. Europe, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, is becoming stronger. And European and American concepts of imperialism, and later Japanese imperialism, says it's okay to beat up on other countries. It eventually worked to the disadvantage of China when the European nations, with their technological progress, first in ships and guns, and then industrial power, moved to enforce their political and economic interests with military power. So that, remember, the Europeans want equality, they want more trade. The Qing want inequality and less trade, but the Qing are getting weaker, and the Europeans are becoming more powerful. So we know what that's going to lead to, and it leads to opium and the Opium War. But that's something we will pick up on Friday. So I'll see you all then. And be ready, we're going to talk about drugs and violence, so it'll be a great day. Actually, it should be more interesting.
So this is basically everything from the read. No. What we got?